so many places, I guess it must be so. But still I cannot see if the savage one is me. How can there be so much that you don't know? You don't know.
All right, welcome back, A-Push students. We want to thank Disney's Pocahontas for that introduction. I know I wanted to listen to the rest of the song, but we don't have time, and I want to give a shout out to Mr. Venord who suggested that song. I actually was thinking of a Madonna song in honor of Queen Elizabeth, but we went with Pocahontas. We're now moving on to a new period in A-Push, period 2, 1607 to 1754. And it's actually going to cover chapters 2 through 5, and we're going to begin with chapter 2, part 1, pages 25 to 33, the planting of English America. So now we're going to talk about the English. We already talked about the Spanish exploration, now we're going to talk about English, and here's our quote for the chapter: "For I shall yet to see it, Virginia, an English nation." English. Interesting spelling by Sir Walter Raleigh, 1602. We'll talk about him a little bit later. Okay, you guys should be familiar with these terms. Old World refers to Europe, New World, the Americas. And chapter 1, we talked about the Spanish conquest and exploration in South America against the Incas, in Mexico against the Aztecs, and up in the Southwest. Now we're going to focus on the English, and they settled along the east coast of North America. The first section for chapter 2 is England's imperial stirrings, and here are three important questions that are going to be covered in this section. Number 1, what were the first colonial settlements and years for England, France, and Spain? We've already mentioned Spain, but we'll talk about that again. What were the main religions of the Irish, English, and Spanish in the 1500s? And then number 3, what countries would be in conflict because of their religious differences? I love maps, and this map we'll probably see again later, but this is Colonial Settlement to the year 1750. We have three countries that settled the New World. We have the Spanish in the Southwest, the French in the Mississippi River region, Ohio Valley region, but also up into Canada. And what we're going to focus on for Chapter 2 mostly is the English colonies along the East Coast. England's first permanent settlement was Jamestown, a must-know in A-Push, in the year 1607, and they were right about this region in Virginia. France, only a year later, their first settlement was Quebec up here along the St. Lawrence River, and Spain had the first settlement only 2 years after Quebec, and that was Santa Fe, located here in the southwest, which is present-day New Mexico. All right, we're going to continue with this section in the book, England's Imperial Stirrings, and talk about religion, the conflict in Europe during the 1500s. One of the most important events in the history of religion happened in 1517. It was called the Protestant Reformation, and that's when Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church, and we have a new Christian religion called Protestantism, and that began in 1517. And it's important because the countries of Europe had to decide were they going to stay Catholic or become a Protestant country. England decides to break away from the Catholic Church and become a Protestant country around the 1530s. However, one of their biggest rivals, Ireland, they remain Catholic. And that becomes an issue really for the next 400, 500 years between the Irish and the English. They have a strong dislike for each other, and a big reason for that is their differences in religion. Besides the conflict between Ireland and England, Spain remained Catholic. And they obviously had differences with Protestant England as well, so they become rivals during the 1500s and 1600s. Okay, the next section is Elizabeth Energizes England. Three important questions in this section include: when was Elizabeth the Queen of England? What happened to Sir Walter Raleigh's Roanoke colony? And what is significant about the year 1588 and the naval battle between England and Spain? I wonder who wins. I wonder what language most people in America speak. Okay, to answer these questions, number 1, Queen Elizabeth ruled England from 1558 to 1603. That is a 45-year reign as Queen of England. She's one of the most remarkable women in history, and she was never married. And so her nickname was the Virgin Queen. Oh my goodness, the Virgin Queen. That's why I think we called the new land Virginia. The first English settlement under Queen Elizabeth was in 1585, founded by Sir Walter Raleigh, and he landed on Roanoke Island in North Carolina. However, this settlement did not survive. In fact, Sir Walter Raleigh actually went back to England after 1585 and came back a few years later, and there was nobody there. All of the men and women that were at the colony, they couldn't find them, and the only thing that they found was inscribed in a tree was the term Croatan. And the lost colony of Roanoke is considered one of life's mysteries. We don't know what happened to those people. It's kind of like the JFK assassination. Was there a second shooter on the grassy knoll? And it's also like one of the mystery of why the Lions are so bad my entire life. And finally, the year 1588 was a turning point in the history of the world because England was able to defeat the mighty Spanish Armada. The Spanish had the best navy in the world in 1588, and that allowed them to be successful into the New World. But now the English won, and so now it's the change. And now this is why England is able to have an easier time colonizing the New World. So 1588, turning point in history, the English defeating the Spanish Armada. The next section is England on the eve of empire, and here are the three main questions for this section. By 1600, what was happening to the population of England? Also by the same year, what was happening to many small farmers in England? And then by the year 1607, a huge key year in APUSH, what becomes a solution to these problems for the Englanders? Continuing this section on England on the eve of empire, England's population grows, and it grows dramatically, partly because of all the new foodstuffs, the corn, the potatoes that come over from the New World. However, with a growing population, they had an economic depression. Okay, and unfortunately, thousands of farmers lost their farms and drifted about England, so they had no place to stay, and they were drifting. It was somewhat similar to the Great Depression in the United States, where we had a million hobos wandering around America looking for jobs. Another problem causing the lack of land for English men is the laws of primogeniture. This is an important term. And basically, this was a law in England that said that only the eldest son could inherit land. So if you're the second oldest son and younger, you were not going to get your dad's land. And so that's why there was so many men in England drifting, looking for work and land. But England's struggles does get a break. And so England's growing population is able to provide labor for the colonies throughout the 1600s. And most of these men are going to be indentured servants, and that's going to be a key term we'll get to later in the next chapter. And finally, important term in APUSH is the term joint stock companies. And this is a group of people, investors, that financed the colonization of North America by the English. The Spanish, most of their exploration was funded by the king and queen, but England was done mostly by joint stock companies, and their goal was to make a profit, and the best way to make a profit is to find gold in the New World. On this slide, I just included a couple of interesting documents that were in this section's reading. The first one is this man right here, Sir Walter Raleigh. We already talked about him, and he is smoking tobacco. But he is not the person I want you to think about when you associate tobacco. And we'll get to that man's name later, who basically helped develop tobacco in the Virginia colony. And finally, here she is in all of her grace and splendor. And wow, Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, never married, but she was one of the most powerful rulers in European history. All right, the next section is England plants the Jamestown seedling in the year 1607, and this is the first permanent English colony that survives in the New World, and it's Jamestown, Virginia. And here are the four key questions, I should say. I had a typo on the first question. It's supposed to say what was the name of the company that founded Jamestown and why did they colonize the place. Number two, what was unusual about the people that went to Jamestown. Number 3, how successful was their first year? And what was John Smith's famous quote? And the quote was not, "I love Pocahontas," or "I paint with all the colors of the wind." All right, we're talking about the section called England Plants a Jamestown Seedling. The name of the joint stock company that founded Jamestown was called the Virginia Company. Another name for it was also the London Company. So you're probably going to have to know both. The first joint stock company that founded Jamestown was Virginia Company of London, or the London Company, and the number one goal of this company was to make a profit. They were in search of gold, and they wanted to make money for their investors. So not only did they want to find the gold, like the Spanish did in Mexico, but they also were looking to find a passage through America to the Indies. And so at this time, they were unaware that North and South America was connected. There he is, John Smith, and he was one of the 100 settlers that started out in the spring of 1607 to Jamestown, and they were all men. Okay, and so they arrived there in 1607, and the first year, I guess you could say, was not too successful because almost half of them died during the first year. Okay, so 40 of them died. They struggled to survive. It was very difficult for them, but John Smith does save the day, okay, because he becomes the leader of the colony, and he has a famous quote, "He who shall not work shall not eat." And so he basically said, if you do not work, you're not going to eat, and you're going to die. Now, we're pretty sure that Pocahontas here probably did not save John Smith from death, even though the Disney version did make it happen. And although it was great for Briella Beemer and she loved the movie, and I got a little emotional as well, I don't think that was the truth. So that's a little bit of historiography there from Disney, but they probably made millions of dollars off it. Okay, the next section is cultural clash in the Chesapeake, and I have this map here showing you where the Chesapeake colonies are located, and there are only two Chesapeake colonies, Virginia, which we talked a little bit already, with Jamestown, and Maryland. So we're going to focus on these two colonies. And these two colonies are called the Chesapeake colonies because they touch the Chesapeake Bay right there. Okay, continuing with the section Cultural Clash in the Chesapeake. Things we need to know is that the settlers at Jamestown, they were very close to a local Indian tribe led by a man named Powhatan or Powhatan. Again, pronunciation I struggle with a lot of words, and so I'm not exactly positive on how to pronounce that, but we'll go with Powhatan. So the most important thing between Powhatan and the English is they really did not like each other, and so the relationship was bad. There was constant warfare in the Virginia colony, and this warfare was called the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. And what do you need to know? It usually is a result of wars, and the English win both wars, and pretty much for the next 300 years, the English are going to win pretty much every war with Native Americans. And eventually Powhatan's Indians were banished from Jamestown region. Very important thought that we've already learned a little bit about are the Indians fell victim to the 3Ds, and we learned already that 90% of Native Americans died mostly because of diseases, but they also struggled because of disorganization. They weren't very connected. There are very few cases in history where Native Americans actually worked together, united. We mentioned the Iroquois from Chapter 1, and we'll talk about one or two others later in history, but for the most part, Native American tribes did not band together against the English. And the final D is disposability. And basically, the English had no purpose for Native Americans, and so they wanted them out of there. If that meant killing them, so be it. And we already, if we compare that to the Spanish, now the Spanish we know treated them very harshly as well. However, they did enslave them, which was a terrible thing through the use of the encomienda system. But we know that the Spanish also did marry and reproduce with the Native American populations, forming the race, the mestizos. And finally, despite Disney's portrayal that Pocahontas was in love with John Smith, she does marry a John, but it was John Ralph. And that was the first interracial union in Virginia. Eventually, Pocahontas does go back to England, as seen in Pocahontas 2, which wasn't as good as the first one. The next section is Virginia, the child of tobacco, and tobacco is a huge crop in the Virginia region, and you need to know it for APUSH, that tobacco saved the Virginia county, and it was mostly because of this person, John Rolfe, called the father of the tobacco industry, saves the county, and tobacco is the chief crop in Virginia for the next hundreds of years. Eventually, the chief crop of the South is cotton, but early on in Virginia, in the Chesapeake, it's tobacco. The problem with tobacco, besides the effects of cancer, and it can really harm your health, is that growing it needs more and more land, and that tobacco would exhaust the soil more than most crops. And so after growing tobacco for a while, you could not grow it anymore because the soil lost nutrients. So the Virginians needed to find more and more land. Unfortunately, that meant moving west. Unfortunately, there was more Native Americans there, and there was more conflict there as they moved closer to the Native Americans. Okay, we're continuing this section on Virginia, the child of tobacco, and this information is a little bit confusing here, and so I redid it up here, and so it's a little bit easier for you to see. And the key thing is the number of African slaves during the 1600s increased dramatically. 1619, that's the first year a slave was in America, was in Virginia. And so there was 20 slaves in 1619. About 30 years later, there's about 300 or so African slaves. But then in the next 50 years, there's a dramatic increase to 10,000 African slaves in Virginia, 14% of the Virginia population. I think this is significant because something had to happen to have such a dramatic rise in African slaves during this time period, and we will learn about that in a later chapter. Final idea on the bottom of this page is in 1619, the House of Burgesses was created, and it's important to know, it's an important APUSH term, and it's the first representative self-government in America in 1619. So the Virginians had their own government system created only 12 years after the founding of Jamestown. The final section for the reading is about Maryland, the Catholic haven. First thing, Maryland was founded by Lord Baltimore in 1634, so about 30 years or so after Jamestown. And the importance is why. Why was Maryland formed? It was formed because Lord Baltimore wanted to make a profit, okay, just like the Virginia Company, but also to provide a refuge for fellow Catholics. We talked about earlier that England became a Protestant nation, and so many Catholics were being persecuted in England, and so this gave them a chance to go to the New World, to America, and to start their own colony. Unfortunately for the Catholics, many Protestants from Virginia started to come up to Maryland, and there was a clash between the two groups. And more Virginians who were Protestant were coming into the Maryland colony. Also, like Virginia, tobacco was a huge crop in Maryland, and white indentured servants was the source of labor on these tobacco farms. And finally, because more and more Protestants were coming up from Virginia, many of the Catholics in Maryland were worried that they would become a minority, and so the government of Maryland passed an important term in APUSH. It's called the Act of Toleration in 1649. The Act of Toleration allowed for the toleration of all Christians, Catholics and Protestants. And the Catholics of Maryland created this law for their own protection because they felt eventually they would become the minority in Maryland, and the Protestants could try to persecute them. And the last part of the act said that non-Christians would receive the death penalty, which, not good. So we covered Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake colonies, and I just wanted to make sure that we're clear that these two colonies are the Chesapeake colonies, but they also are part of the southern colonies. And the rest of Chapter 2 will focus on the remaining southern colonies, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia.